The silence in the grand ballroom was louder than the insult that had just been hurled. Shin Tae-oh's date didn't just walk away. She made sure every elite family in the city heard her call him a limping king, who was nothing more than a cripple. Tae-oh sat motionless, his knuckles white as he gripped the cold ebony of his cane. For the first time in 34 years, a man who moved millions with a whisper felt completely invisible, until a small, warm hand touched his knee. He looked down, expecting a waiter with a bill he'd never pay, but instead, he found a pair of wide, curious eyes. "Is your stick made of stars?" the little girl asked, her voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a blade of light. Behind her stood Sloane Whitaker, a woman whose gaze held none of the pity Tae-oh had grown to loathe. She didn't look at his leg, she looked at the man beneath the scars. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice rich and steady, "but my daughter has a habit of finding the most interesting person in the room, and it looks like she's outdone herself tonight." In that moment, the world stopped watching Tae-oh's failure and started watching a new beginning. The clink of expensive silverware against fine porcelain usually signaled another victory for the Shin Empire, but tonight, it sounded like a slow-motion car crash. The grand dining room of the Apex Plaza was filled with the city's elite, yet the air around table 14 was freezing. Shin Tae-oh sat perfectly still, his knuckles white as he gripped the silver dragon head of his cane. Across from him, the chair was empty. His date had left 5 minutes ago, but her parting words still hung in the air like a poisonous fog. "I can't be the woman who has to help you into a car for the rest of my life, Tae-oh," she had hissed, loud enough for the neighboring tables to catch every syllable. She didn't just walk out, she made sure to leave him in the middle of a spotlight of public humiliation. For a man whose reputation was built on being the Iron Dragon, the sight of him sitting alone, unable to even stand quickly enough to stop her, was a catastrophic blow. He felt the eyes of the room burning into his neck, pity from some, mockery from others. Tae-oh closed his eyes for a second, trying to steady his breathing. The nerve damage in his hip was flaring up, a hot, electric reminder of the accident that had tried to bury him 6 months ago. He was trapped. If he tried to stand now, his leg might buckle, and the spectacle would be complete. He was a king on a glass throne, watching the cracks spread beneath his feet. He didn't notice the small shadow approaching until a warm, tiny hand touched his knee. He flinched, his instinct for defense kicking in, but as he looked down, his anger died. A young girl, no older than 6, stood there with wide, curious eyes. She wasn't looking at his expensive suit or the tattoos creeping up his neck. She was staring at his ebony cane. "Is your stick made of stars?" the girl whispered. Her voice was a blade of light that cut through the suffocating tension of the room. Tae-oh blinked, his voice rasping as he found it. "The dragon, only if you believe he is, little one." "Sarah, baby, we don't bother people while they're having their dinner." A new voice joined them. It was steady, rich, and held a warmth that the marble room lacked. Tae-oh looked up to see Sloane Whitaker. She wasn't dressed in the loud, designer labels of the other women in the room. She wore a simple, elegant blue blouse, her hair pulled back in a way that emphasized her sharp, intelligent features. She didn't look at Tae-oh with the polite disgust he was used to. She looked at him with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. "He's not a bother," Tae-oh said, his voice regaining some of its steel. "He's the only person in this room who seems to have any manners tonight." Sloane's gaze dropped to the way Tae-oh was sitting. She didn't look away from his cane. Instead, she leaned in closer, her brow furrowing in a way that wasn't pity, it was professional concern. "You're guarding your left side so hard you're going to give yourself a secondary spinal injury," she said softly. Tae-oh stiffened. "And who asked for your medical opinion?" "No one," Sloane replied, pulling out the chair his date had vacated. "But I've spent the last 10 years helping people walk again. And right now, you look like a man who's about to let his pride keep him in this chair until the lights go out. Sarah, sit down. I think this gentleman needs a reason to stay a little longer." Tae-oh watched in stunned silence as the two of them sat. The whispers in the room reached a fever pitch. Who was this woman? Why was she sitting with the fallen dragon? For the first time in his life, Tae-oh didn't care about the board members watching him. He looked at the girl, then at the mother, and for a fleeting second, the pain in his hip felt just a little bit lighter. The world was watching his failure, but Sloane was watching his potential. The hour that followed was unlike anything Shin Tae-oh had experienced since his world turned gray. Sloane Whitaker didn't treat him like a mafia boss, and she didn't treat him like a victim. To her, he was a puzzle, a complex system of muscles and nerves that were currently screaming for help. As Sarah occupied herself by drawing star dragons on a paper napkin, Sloane began to dismantle the walls Tae-oh had spent months building. "The doctors told you to accept it, didn't they?" Sloane asked, her eyes never leaving his. "They gave you the cane, told you the nerve damage was permanent, and sent you on your way with a bottle of pills." Tae-oh tightened his grip on the dragonhead handle. "They said I should be grateful to be alive, that a limp is a small price to pay for surviving a car bomb." Sloane made a soft, clicking sound with her tongue. "Surviving isn't the same as living, Tae-oh. They gave you a crutch because they didn't want to do the hard work of retraining your brain. You're not broken. You're just out of alignment." She reached into her bag and slid a simple white card across the table. Whitaker Mobility Specialist. It wasn't gold embossed. It didn't have a corporate logo. It just had a phone number and an address in a part of the city Tae-oh's motorcade usually drove through at high speeds. "You realize what people will say if they see me at a clinic like yours?" Tae-oh asked, his voice low. "My enemies look for any sign of weakness. If I'm seen seeking therapy from a woman who doesn't have a high society pedigree, they'll smell blood in the water." Sloane leaned forward, her face inches from his. The scent of vanilla and antiseptic followed her. "Then let them smell it. While they're busy laughing at your weakness, you'll be learning how to stand without that stick. I don't care about your enemies, Mr. Shin. I care about the fact that you're 34 years old and you're already giving up on your own body." Sarah looked up from her drawing, her small face solemn. "Mommy says that the biggest dragons are the ones who know how to hide their fire until they need it." Tae-oh looked at the child, then back at Sloane. There was a challenge in her eyes, a dare. She was telling him that his pride was his real disability, not his leg. For months, he had been surrounded by yes-men who pitied him and rivals who mocked him. Sloane was the first person to look at him and demand more. "My office. Tomorrow at 10, Tae-oh said, trying to regain control of the narrative. Sloane stood up, tucking Sarah's drawing into her pocket. She didn't look impressed. "No, my clinic. Tomorrow at 8. I don't do house calls for men who are afraid to leave their castles. If you want to walk like a king again, you have to be willing to start at the bottom of the hill." She walked away without looking back. Her stride was confident, her head held high, leaving Tae-oh sitting in the middle of a room that was still buzzing with confusion. He looked at the card in his hand. It felt heavier than his cane. He knew the board would hear about this by morning. Elder Myung would call it a scandal. His rivals would call it a joke. But as Tae-oh used his cane to lever himself up, he used the specific muscle group Sloane had pointed to. The pain was sharp, but his balance was better. He watched her disappear through the glass doors. She was a risk he couldn't afford and a chance he couldn't pass up. The boardroom of Shin Logistics felt more like a courtroom the next morning. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the cold, sterile energy of men who measured life in profit margins. At the head of the table sat Elder Myung, the man who had been a second father to Tae-oh, but who now looked at him like a faulty piece of machinery. "The reports from the Apex Plaza are disappointing, Tae-oh," Myung began, his voice like dry parchment rubbing together. "The daughter of Minister Han is distraught. She says you insulted her family's honor by refusing to acknowledge your limitations. And then you were seen dining with a commoner, a foreign woman with a child." Tae-oh didn't flinch. He sat at the head of the table, his cane resting against the mahogany like a weapon. "Minister Han's daughter is a child who wanted a trophy, not a husband. I saved us a lifetime of headache by letting her walk away. As for the woman, she is a consultant." "A consultant?" Myung laughed, a short, bitter sound. "She is a physical therapist from the South Side, Tae-oh. We are in the middle of a $5 billion merger with the Tech K Group. They value tradition. They value strength. They want to see a leader who is whole, not a man who spends his evenings being lectured by a girl who doesn't even know who she's talking to." Tae-oh's jaw tightened. Strength isn't about the way a man walks, Mayung. It's about the way he leads. In our world, they are the same thing. Mayung slammed his hand on the table. The board is already talking about a transition. They think the accident took more than just your mobility. They think it took your judgment. If you continue to see this woman, if you make yourself a spectacle in her neighborhood, we will move to have you removed as CEO for medical reasons. The threat hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Tae-oh knew the bylaws. If the board declared him physically unfit, they could strip him of his voting rights. He would be a figurehead, a prisoner of his own legacy, while Mayung and his cronies sold off the company piece by piece. "You're telling me to choose between my health and my company?" Tae-oh asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm telling you to be the man your father was," Mayung countered. "He never let a personal whim jeopardize the Shin name. Drop this therapist. Find a respectable woman to stand by your side at the Heritage Gala next week. Prove you are still the dragon, or we will find someone who can." Tae-oh watched them file out of the room, their expensive shoes clicking on the marble like a countdown. He stayed in the silence, staring at the cards Sloane had given him. He knew what Mayung wanted. He wanted Tae-oh to stay broken but quiet, to hide away in his mansion until the merger was complete. But Tae-oh remembered the way Sarah had looked at his cane as if it held magic. He remembered the way Sloane had looked at him, as if he were a man worth saving. If he gave in now, he wasn't just losing his company, he was losing the last shred of hope he had for a real life. He picked up his phone and dialed his driver. "Cancel my lunch with the investors," Tae-oh commanded. "And get the car ready, we're going to the south side, and lose the security detail. I don't want to draw a crowd." He was going to her world, not as a boss, not as a victim, but as a student. And if the board wanted a war, he would give them one they wouldn't soon forget. The South Side Clinic was a far cry from the glass and steel towers of the Shin headquarters. It was a modest brick building with a mural of a sun on the side, and the lobby was filled with the sounds of children laughing and the smell of lavender. When Tae-oh stepped inside, his sharp, black suit felt like armor in a world that didn't need it. He found Sloane in a small courtyard in the back. She wasn't in a lab coat. She was wearing leggings and a t-shirt, helping a toddler navigate a set of foam stairs. Sarah was nearby, diligently watering a row of potted sunflowers. When the little girl saw Tae-oh, her face lit up. "You came, you brought the star stick," she shouted, running over to him. Tae-oh looked down, his hand hovering awkwardly before he gave the girl a stiff, polite nod. He looked at Sloane, who didn't stop her session. She just glanced over her shoulder. "You're 3 minutes late, Mr. Shin. In this clinic, time is the only currency that matters." "I had complications," Tae-oh said, looking around the humble space. "Life is a complication," Sloane replied, standing up and dusting off her knees. "Sarah, go help Mrs. Gable with the snacks. Mr. Shin and I have work to do." She led him to a patch of grass near a small playground. "The board doesn't like me being here," Tae-oh admitted, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings for any sign of a photographer. "They think you're a distraction. They think I'm losing my mind." "Good," Sloane said, crossing her arms. "A man who's losing his mind is a man who's finally open to new ideas. Now, give me the cane." Tae-oh bristled. "I can't walk without it, Sloane, especially not on uneven ground." "You think you can't," she countered, "but your brain is just lying to you to protect you from pain. Give it to me." Reluctantly, he handed over the ebony stick. Without it, he felt exposed, lopsided. The fear of falling, the fear of looking pathetic, was a cold weight in his chest. 10 steps, Sloane commanded, pointing to a wooden bench. "Don't look at your feet, look at Sarah, she's watching you." Tae-oh took the first step. It was a staggering, ugly movement. His hip burned, a sharp reminder of the shrapnel that had shredded the muscle. He felt the sweat break out on his forehead. Every instinct told him to reach out, to grab a wall, to hide. But then he saw Sarah. The little girl had stopped watering her flowers and was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "You can do it, Mr. Dragon," she whispered. Tae-oh gritted his teeth. He took the second step, then the third. He wasn't the Iron Dragon in this moment, he was just a man. He reached the 5th step and his leg buckled. Sloane was there in an instant, her strong arms catching him before he hit the grass. She didn't pull him up with pity, she held him steady, her face inches from his. "See that," she whispered. "You didn't fall, you just found your limit. Tomorrow we move the limit." In that moment, Tae-oh realized that Sloane wasn't just healing his leg, she was healing the shame. She was the only person who saw that his disability was a battle he was still fighting, not a defeat he had to accept. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the board was right about one thing. Sloane Whitaker was a distraction. But she was the only thing in his life that felt real. While Tae-oh was finding his balance on a South Side playground, a different kind of trap was being laid in the ivory towers of the city. Harrison Vance, the CEO of Vance Global and Tae-oh's most predatory rival, sat in his glass office, watching a grainy cell phone video of Tae-oh staggering across a park. Vance smiled, a cold, thin expression. "He's vulnerable," he murmured to his assistant. "But the board is too cowardly to move unless we give them a reason. If we can't break the dragon, we break the woman." 2 hours later, Sloane was closing up the clinic for the night when a black luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, Harrison Vance himself. He didn't have Tae-oh's raw power, but he had a slick, polished charm that made Sloane's skin crawl. "Ms. Whitaker," Vance began, his voice smooth as silk. "I've heard remarkable things about your work with difficult cases. My foundation is looking for a director for a new state-of-the-art facility in Manhattan. The salary is 5 times what you make here, full benefits for your daughter, a private school scholarship." Sloane paused, her key in the lock. "And what's the price of this generosity, Mr. Vance? I've lived long enough to know that a man like you doesn't give away scholarships for free." Vance stepped closer, his smile never wavering. "It's quite simple. Our donors are very traditional. They value discretion. We would need you to sign a non-association clause. Specifically, regarding the Shin family. We can't have our director being seen at late-night dinners with people of questionable character." Sloane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. This wasn't a job offer. It was a bribe. Vance wanted to isolate Tae-oh, to take away the one person who was helping him find his strength, so the board could finally finish him off. "You want me to walk away from a patient so you can win a corporate war?" Sloane asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady hum. "I want you to secure your daughter's future," Vance countered, leaning against the brick wall. "Tae-oh is a sinking ship, Sloane. He's one board meeting away from being a memory. Why go down with him? Take the offer. Move to Manhattan. Give Sarah a life she doesn't have to water in a dirt patch." Sloane looked at the folder he held out, a contract that represented everything she had ever dreamed of for her daughter. Stability, safety, wealth. But then she thought of Tae-oh in the park, the way he had sweated and struggled just to take 5 steps for a 6-year-old. She thought of the Iron Dragon, who was currently learning how to be a man again. "I'll think about it," Sloane said, taking the folder. Vance nodded, confident that every person had a price. "Don't think too long, Ms. Whitaker. Opportunities like this have a way of disappearing, just like reputations." As his car sped away, Sloane looked down at the contract. She knew that if she stayed with Tae-oh, she was putting a target on her back. She was putting Sarah in the crosshairs of a war they didn't ask for. But as she looked at a drawing Sarah had left on the desk, a picture of a man and a dragon walking side by side, she knew that some things were more important than a penthouse in Manhattan. The night of the Heritage Gala was the most important date on the city's social calendar. It was a night of tuxedos, tiaras, and backroom deals. For Shin Tae-oh, it was supposed to be the night he surrendered. The board expected him to arrive alone, to sit quietly in the back, and to eventually sign the merger papers that would end his reign. The lobby of the grand ballroom was a sea of whispers as the elite gathered. Elder Mayung stood near the entrance, checking his watch. "He's late," he hissed to his assistant. "If he doesn't show, we call for the vote tonight." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors swung open. The room went silent. Tae-oh didn't arrive in his usual armored motorcade. He didn't have a dozen bodyguards clearing the path, and he wasn't hiding his limp. He walked into the room with a slow, deliberate pace. He still had his cane, but he wasn't leaning on it like a crutch. He held it like a scepter. But it wasn't Tae-oh that caused the gasps. It was the woman on his arm. Sloane Whitaker was a vision in deep emerald silk, her hair styled in a regal updo that commanded respect. She didn't look like a commoner from the South Side. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. Beside her, little Sarah was dressed in a matching dress, her hand firmly in Tae-oh's. The socialites froze. This was a direct violation of every unwritten rule in their world. Tae-oh hadn't just brought a guest. He had brought a family, a black woman and her child, into the heart of the most traditional, exclusionary event in the country. Elder Mayung marched toward them, his face a mask of fury. Tae-oh, what is the meaning of this? This is a private event for the stakeholders. You bring this to the night of the merger. Tae-oh stopped, standing tall despite the fire in his hip. He didn't look at Mayung with anger. He looked at him with a cold, terrifying clarity. You told me to show the board that I was whole, Mayung. You told me to prove I was the dragon. He gestured to Sloane and Sarah. This is what wholeness looks like. It's not about hiding my scars or pretending I don't hurt. It's about having the strength to stand with the people who actually see me. If the Tech K group wants to partner with a man who hides his truth, they've come to the wrong house. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the chandeliers. Harrison Vance stood on the mezzanine, his jaw tight as he watched the scene. He realized his gilded trap had backfired. By trying to bribe Sloane, he had only proven to her that Tae-oh was the only man in this city worth fighting for. Tae-oh turned to the crowd, his voice echoing through the ballroom. The merger papers are on the table, but I'm not signing them. I'm rewriting them to include a new community initiative, starting with a state-of-the-art mobility center on the South Side. If the board doesn't like it, then the board can find a new dragon. But I think they'll find that I'm much harder to replace than they thought. He began to walk, his limp visible, his cane clicking on the marble with a steady, rhythmic defiance. Sloane walked beside him, her head held high, her hand a warm anchor on his arm. They weren't just a couple, they were a revolution. And as the city's elite watched them pass, they realized that the limping king wasn't a victim at all. He was finally, for the first time in his life, truly powerful. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted from stunned silence to a frantic, low-frequency hum of gossip. Shin Tae-oh didn't flinch. He led Sloane and Sarah toward the center of the room, where the silent auction items, rare art, antique jewelry, and tech patents were displayed under crystalline lights. Every step he took was a calculated risk. His hip was screaming, the muscles seizing under the weight of his defiance, but with Sloane's hand on his arm, the pain felt like a secondary concern. You didn't tell me we were starting a war tonight, Sloane whispered, her smile fixed for the cameras, though her eyes were sharp and alert. She looked around at the women in their million-dollar necklaces, realizing that her presence was more than just a date. It was a disruption of a centuries-old social order. In my world, Sloane, you don't ask for a seat at the table, you take it, Tae-oh replied, his voice barely audible over the clinking of champagne flutes. He stopped in front of a centerpiece, a rare obsidian sculpture of a tiger. Harrison Vance is watching us from the balcony. He thinks he's already won because he offered you a way out. He's waiting for you to flinch. Sloane didn't look up at the balcony. Instead, she adjusted Sarah's dress and looked at the sculpture. He offered me a life that Sarah wouldn't have to struggle in. But he forgot one thing: I've never been afraid of the struggle. I'm only afraid of being a coward. The tension reached a breaking point when Elder Mayung approached again, flanked by two of the company's largest shareholders. Their faces were carved out of stone. Tae-oh, enough of this theater. The Tech K representatives are in the library. They are refusing to sign until this distraction is removed from the building. You are jeopardizing decades of work for a woman you met in a restaurant. Tae-oh turned to face them, his cane clicking sharply on the floor. The Tech K group wants our logistics network because it's the most efficient in the hemisphere. They don't care who I dine with. They care that you've convinced them I'm too weak to lead. You're using my personal life to cover for your own attempt at a coup. He leaned in closer to Mayung, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet rumble. If they want to walk away, let them. But tell them this: If they leave this building without my signature, I will personally ensure that every dock from here to Singapore is closed to their cargo by morning. I may have a limp, Mayung, but my reach is longer than ever." The shareholders exchanged panicked glances. They had forgotten that beneath the broken exterior, the iron dragon still had teeth. Tae-oh didn't wait for a response. He turned back to Sloane, his expression softening just a fraction. "Let's show Sarah the gardens. I think she's had enough of these vultures for one night." As they walked away, the silent auction felt less like a charity event and more like a funeral for the old guard. Tae-oh had successfully flipped the script, but he knew the counterattack was coming, and it wouldn't be on a ballroom floor. The morning after the gala brought the cold reality of the fallout. Tae-oh sat in his home office, the curtains drawn against the harsh sunlight. On his desk lay a legal document, a formal ultimatum from the board of directors. They were calling for an emergency vote of no confidence based on his physical health and his erratic behavior. He had 6 hours to respond or forfeit his chairmanship. The door opened, and Sloane walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She looked tired but resolved. "Vance called again," she said, setting a cup on his desk. "He said the offer for the Manhattan clinic expires at noon. He told me that if I stay, the board will ensure my clinic's license is reviewed for safety violations." Tae-oh looked up, his eyes dark with guilt. "I brought you into a burning building, Sloane. I thought I could protect you, but these men, they don't fight with honor. They fight with fire." Sloane sat on the edge of the desk, ignoring the legal papers. "Do you know why I became a mobility specialist, Tae-oh? Because when my father lost his legs in the war, the world told him he was half a man. They took his job, they took his pride, and they waited for him to fade away. I spent my life making sure that never happens to anyone else." She leaned forward, taking his hand. "You aren't a burning building. You're a man who is finally learning how to stand. If we run now, we're telling Sarah that when things get hard, you trade your soul for a quiet life. I'm not going to New York, and you aren't resigning." Tae-oh felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years, not power, but peace. He picked up the ultimatum and ripped it in half. "Then we don't respond with lawyers," he said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "We respond with the truth." He called his head of security. "Gather the press, not the business journals, the local news, and get the footage from the warehouse accident that broke my leg, the unedited version." For months, the board had controlled the narrative, claiming the accident was due to Tae-oh's negligence. But Tae-oh had the proof that the accident was actually a deliberate act of sabotage ordered by a shell company linked to Mayung's nephew. He had been holding it as a nuclear option, waiting for the right moment to strike. "If they want to talk about health and stability," Tae-oh muttered as he watched the files upload, "let's talk about the health of this company's soul." He looked at Sloane, realizing that her strength had given him the courage to stop playing their game. He wasn't going to the board meeting to defend himself. He was going there to burn the table down and build something new in its place. The boardroom was packed. Elder Mayung sat at the head of the table, his hand hovering over the gavel, ready to finalize the vote that would end Tae-oh's career. The Tech-K representatives sat in the back, looking uncomfortable. They were seconds away from a decision that would change the landscape of the city's economy forever. The doors burst open. Tae-oh didn't limp in this time. He walked with a steady, practiced gait, his cane barely touching the floor. Behind him walked Sloane, carrying a tablet that was already streaming a live broadcast to every major news outlet in the city. "You're late, Tae-oh," Mayung sneered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "The vote is already in progress." "Then I'm just in time for the rebuttal," Tae-oh said, slamming the tablet onto the center of the table. The screen showed the sabotage footage, clear evidence of the board's corruption. "The city is watching, Mayung. They're watching the men who tried to kill their CEO because he wouldn't let them strip the company for parts." The room erupted into chaos. The Tech-K representatives stood up, realizing they had been lied to. Mayung turned pale, his hand trembling as he realized the Iron Dragon hadn't been weakened by his disability. He had been refined by it. "This company isn't yours anymore," Tae-oh declared, his voice booming through the hall. "I'm taking it private, And the first order of business is the Whitaker Mobility Center, a fully funded, world-class facility that will serve every neighborhood this board has ignored for decades. He turned to the cameras, his gaze steady. To the people of this city, I was told that being broken meant I was finished. I was told that the woman standing beside me didn't belong in this world. But the truth is, she is the only reason I'm still standing. We aren't just a logistics company anymore. We are a promise that no one gets left behind. As the police entered to escort Mayung and his associates out for questioning, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of humiliation. It was the silence of a new era. Tae-oh felt the exhaustion hitting him, the physical toll of the last few days, but as Sloane took his hand, he felt stronger than he ever had at the height of his perfection. They walked out of the building together, into the bright afternoon sun where Sarah was waiting, playing with a small dragon toy. Tae-oh looked at the city, no longer seeing it as a battlefield to be conquered, but as a home to be built. He leaned down, picking up Sarah and perching her on his good hip. "Is the stick still magic?" Sarah asked, touching the silver dragon on his cane. Tae-oh smiled, looking at Sloane, whose eyes were filled with a quiet, earned victory. "No, Sarah," he whispered. "The magic was never in the stick. It was in the people who stayed when I thought I was sitting alone." The Iron Dragon had found his heart, and for the first time in history, the Empire wasn't built on fear. It was built on a walk through the park, a table for two, and a love that refused to look away.